Well, good morning, everybody, while we wait for that, or good whatever time of day it is for you. Here we go. So thank you for joining us today on this latest session of Ask the Editors. What I'm going to do is a quick, I'm Morris Allen. I'm the editor of Metaphorosis and your host today. We'll do a quick round of introductions, and then we'll get straight to your questions. I would ask you to stay muted when you're not actually asking a question, but we're pretty informal here. If it gets too busy, then you can use the raise hands feature or something like that. But generally, you'll be able to just jump in. So again, I'm Benjamin. That's my secret hidden name. I'm Morris. I'm the editor of Metaphorosis. It's an online and print magazine. We publish a new story every Friday. All original stories. We're in our 8th year now. We also publish annual anthologies with all the stories that we published in the year and also a best of. So that's that. And I'm going to go in the order that people are on my screen generally. So Fran, if you want to introduce yourself. Fran is frozen, so let's go to Andrew.
Yeah, okay. In Fran's brief absence, hopefully. Yeah, my name's Andrew. Critchley is the screen shows, but Leon Hudson is the full pseudonym. I'm editor of Mythaxis magazine, which is the longest running online magazine called Mythaxis. There is a second one now, as of about 2020, but we're mythaxis.co.uk. We publish quarterly. We basically speculative fiction in all its forms, although we're sort of edging open towards crime as well, which is an area of fiction that I enjoy. And, you know, we're small but perfectly formed.
All right, Fran.
Hi, I'm Fran Eisemann, the publisher for Cosmic Roots and Eldritch Shores. We do science fiction, fantasy, myth, legend, fairy tales, and Eldritch stories. We'll do new and reprints. And we're just online now, and we illustrate our stories. We only do maybe 14 stories or so a year, actually. And then we do some interviews, articles. And we're getting towards having ready our first anthology, which is a benefit anthology for Ukraine, called To Ukraine with Love.
Excellent. Well, let's just jump straight in then. Anybody, be brave. Any questions right off? If not, I'll fill the gap. Go ahead, Jim.
I'm very new to this, and I'm wondering if I sell a short story to one of your publications, how much control do I actually lose of the story? Say if in a year or two I want to make it into a novel, or maybe publish an anthology myself, or maybe even come back and correct something. What happens in that?
All right, let me answer that one first, and then we'll go through. In our case, and I think that this will be similar for many magazines, what we buy is the first publication rights. So we buy the rights to publish your story exclusively for a period of about 6 months, and then non-exclusively after that until basically such time as you tell us to stop. We don't have any other rights. So if you wanted to revise that, if you wanted to turn it into a novel, a novelette, if you wanted to issue it in a different form, you're free to do anything you want with it. So, yeah, go ahead, Fran.
I just add that every magazine may have their own rules of what they want in terms of rights. It's good always to read the contract. They should have a contract. If they don't, then that's not a good sign, because you don't know really what you're giving away or signing away. So always, they should have somewhere on their site a copy of their contract to read, and then you can see specifically what's included. And if one thing is important to you, like, no, I don't want it ever to be an audiobook. So you say, I'd agree to everything else but this. Is that okay with you? So there's a little bit of room for negotiation, but it's different for each magazine.
Andrew.
And yeah, I'd reiterate everything that's been said. I'd go also to the point that if you take a story idea isn't what you're copywriting. You know, you're creating a version of a story. So if you sell me a short story, but then you want to take that same concept and expand it into a novel, or even if you just want to try again as a short story form and re-explore that concept, I mean, that's not the same thing you've sold me. Certainly, when it comes to something like a novel, it's an idea that you're exploring in different forms. So I'd certainly have, and I'm just absolutely certain, not being a contract lawyer, certain that across the board we're talking about completely different things. It's not something that you would have to fear is somehow going to be a rights grab on the part of someone you've sold a short story to. But yeah, and to specifically reiterate, in our case, our contract says 6 months exclusivity, but in practice, when someone who we've taken a story from has contacted me because, for example, they want to submit it to an anthology or they want to include it in their own collection, we would typically waive that exclusivity. It's not to say that the story would disappear from our website, but I'm not in the business of preventing authors from expressing their work where they want to. So it's really, it's when I hit publish and the magazine goes live that I know I'm not in that moment in competition with another version of that story elsewhere. But if 2 months later someone says, you know, I desperately want to submit it to this best of, or it's been invited to an anthology, I'm going to say yes.
Yeah, and I would add to that most magazines will have this information on their guidelines page. That is what rights they're buying. And ideally, they'll have a template or a version of their contract online for you to look at as well. But you should feel free to ask for that. And if they do make you an offer, then much as I hate to admit it, the contract is negotiable. It's an agreement between the two parties. As Fran said, I'd certainly rather that my authors don't negotiate the contract because it's a lot easier for me. But if, as Fran said, if they really want to retain the audio rights, we can work that out. So we have a question from Akis. How dark are you willing to let a story get for your magazine? Where do you draw the line? Fran.
We don't like it very dark. We don't like a lot of violence or, no horror, no thing where the main part of the story is someone being horrified and terrified for their life all the way through, that they're going to get chopped up to pieces or something. We don't want anything like that. And we say it in the guidelines. So basically, we don't want any story that ends up, as we say, getting the joy in life sucked out of the reader and they end up miserable at the end of the story. We don't go for that kind of thing. That's us.
Okay, Andrew.
Yeah, for me, I'm okay with horror. I think I've said previously that there are some things that I won't touch as subject matter. So anything that sort of trivializes or, well, I won't say absolutely definitively incorporates, for example, but anything that treats it, that kind of very strong subject matter in a kind of trivial way would basically be a definite no sale. I say that acknowledging that, let's see, back in last summer, I took a story by an American Ukrainian author called Elena Gomel, which was quite strong in its content. And it's not the first time we've taken something that's quite strong in its content. So, you know, a dark story. And generally speaking, I'm okay with it. But, you know, it's on a case-by-case basis. When it's something like that, it's really quite powerful stuff. And I have concerns about how it's treated. Yeah, it'd be something that I'd err on the side of caution with. So things like, you know, the subjects like sexual assault and suicide and the treatment of the death of children, for example, are things that would be tough sales, not necessarily impossible, but tough.
For us, we don't do horror. We only do science fiction and fantasy. I'm just not very interested in horror. But I'm perfectly fine with dark stories. Not as Andrew has said. If you've got animal torture in there, etc., for no reason, I'm not interested in that. But if it's a dark story that leaves everybody depressed at the end, that's okay with me as long as it's a good story. Other questions?
Okay.
Yes, go ahead. TL.
Hi there. I had a question about the definition of genre fiction for each of you, and I suspect the answer might be a little different as to what sort of fits or doesn't fit. But I read a lot of fantasy. I love fantasy and I love sci-fi. But arguably, I think, for example, Terry Brooks, my favorite book of his, Running with the Demon, might have the least fantastical elements out of all of his books. So I'm wondering, for you, what's the difference between a fantasy or a science fiction or any kind of genre story versus, say, a literary story with just elements of the fantastical or the sci-fi? Like, where do you draw that line?
Fran, you want to take that first?
I don't know. I don't think there's a clear-cut line there. But when you say literary, to me it sounds literary is more like the writing might be beautiful, and that might be much more of the focus of the story. There might be beautiful moments and vignettes, well done, rather than something that's a story that you have a plot and you have a goal and you go through it. That, to me, that's a big difference. And also for science fiction, well, for science fiction, the science would have to be intrinsic to the plot. Not just somebody walking around with lasers and you say they're on Mars, but everything else is just the same. It's just like a relationship story or something, but they happen to be on Mars and they carry lasers. So that's the difference. The fantasy element, the magic, or the science has to be central to the plot. Part of what that's
And
not
you
the
froze there
focus.
for a moment for me anyway. You were
Me
saying
too.
Oh,
part of.
yeah, I'm sorry because I'm on satellite, so there's going to be times when it just goes out. What was the last thing I said? Well, basically the difference is whether the science fiction or the fantasy or the myth is intrinsic to the plot, or whether it's just incidental, a side element.
Okay.
That would make the difference to me.
Andrew.
Yeah, I generally think of genres as kind of shades of grey, a bit like if you imagine a kind of a color chart, let's just for the sake of argument, with science fiction at the top, fantasy in one quadrant, horror in another quadrant, and you can kind of gradient around that circle. And so for me, something extremely hard sci-fi, is easy to identify in that way, and then you go sort of more and more towards fantasy in one direction, more and more towards horror in another. If I compared that with, I mean, like you say in your question, literary fiction, you will get examples of magic realism or non-real content. So my go-to is the Satanic Verses, for example. And I think you can read that as just an all-out fantasy novel. Right basically from page one, you have people falling out of the sky, transforming into an angel and a demon. So there's a very literal sense in which we're in fantasy territory. But then I guess what makes that categorized as not merely, I can use merely, a piece of genre fiction is, an extended exercise in style and thoughtfulness. And, there's elements that, bestow upon it this kind of literary title. But I like science fiction. I like the Satanic Verses, but I like science fiction. I like fantasy. I like horror. I think these different things are, they will have equal value to me as long as the story is good. I don't think it necessarily has to be a piece of, literary, it doesn't need to be a piece of literary masterworks to satisfy good entertainment.
I would say that I think I agree with much of what Fran and Andrew have said, though I think for me at least, to some extent, it's in the eye of the beholder, and to some extent in marketing, depending on who you are as an author and who you've marketed towards and what your reputation is will depend whether you're categorized as literary or genre. I don't think it makes a huge difference, certainly to me. We've published things that are straight fantasy, straight science fiction with the lasers and the science and everything. And we've published things where, you're never quite sure whether it was fairies in the garden or it was just an illusion.
That tale.
Yeah. So it really depends on what you want. For me, there has to be some sort of a speculative element. There has to be at least an element where it could be magic or it could be science fiction. The fantasy ones are the ones that are harder, I guess, to separate out. But I don't think it's really, to me, and at least that important a distinction. I don't think about it much. I think, is this a good story? I guess we tend toward the literary a little bit more in our preferred style, but it has to have speculative in it. So that may not be very helpful, but that's the answer. We've got a question from John. Actually, I think there was one above that. Hold on just a moment. Yeah, from Akis. What types of stories are you craving the most right now? Would you like to give us some prompts of things you'd love to see? I'm going to answer that one first, just very quickly, because we accept all manner of science fiction and fantasy. There's no particular subgenre that we're looking at. The one thing that I would say that we don't get much of, because it's hard to do, is short epic fantasy that's not D&D. It's hard to fit an epic story into less than 10,000 words. So I think that's part of the explanation, but I'd certainly love to see more of that kind of high fantasy that is serious high fantasy, but isn't just elves and dwarves and magic users. Let's go around the other way. Andrew.
Yeah, I really enjoy utopic fiction as opposed to dystopic fiction. I read an interesting book a couple of years ago looking at the critical utopias of the 70s. It was works by Le Guin, a few others. The Female Man was one of them. Woman on the Edge of Time was another. Really great novels. And I've had a few pieces submitted that I would classify as utopias in that sense, not of presenting some kind of idealized perfect world, but of presenting the struggle to progress the culture towards a better place, rather than just to kind of, vicariously enjoy the thrill of the dark place that dystopia tends to have its foundation in. I'm a big fan of Kim Stanley Robinson's writing, and he's a writer in that utopic sense of demonstrating, this ideal quest that doesn't necessarily just enjoy the ideal reality. It's about achieving that objective and confronting the challenges. So that's something I find interesting. And if I had to pick another, I'd say, and this goes back to the interest I have in crime fiction, I've had a few submissions I haven't taken that I've really lingered over because they're bringing what I see as elements of classic crime fiction into speculative fiction. And if I was seeing more of that, I'd be very happy, because it's something that I've been close to taking a few times. A few times I've gone back and forth with authors, but we haven't quite come to an agreement. But yeah, that's something that I would like to see more.
Okay, Fran.
I don't know, this is a difficult question for me. I'm not. I guess I would like to see more hard science fiction that and fantasy that doesn't have the usual, elves and dwarves thing. And I guess just something that's like more inspiring, some really strong characters, really clever dialogue, plots that twist around and give you surprises, and just really well written. I don't have anything really specific aside from that.
Fran, let me follow up with a question that I skipped over earlier from John Pohl that I think is for you, because I can't answer it.
Oh.
What is the difference between dark fantasy and dark eldritch? Since you have Eldritch in your name, I'm posting that.
Yeah, yeah. Hi, John. Well, Eldritch is, some people associate it with horror because it's been mentioned like in Lovecraft and things like that. But I just take Eldritch as being kind of on the edge of things, strange and spooky and maybe spine tingling. It's liminal. It's like, did I just see something out of the corner of my eye? It's eerie. And it's hard to define. So we don't get many really Eldritch stories. Fantasy, I think, doesn't have that that element of strangeness, where you don't quite know what's going on. I don't know what else to say about it. We've had trouble trying to define Eldritch, but it is a separate thing from fantasy. I think the fantasy tends to be more straightforward, whereas the Eldritch is just weird and kind of, you don't know what's going on, but it's not horror. It's not grief and suffering and getting torn apart.
Okay.
Sorry.
Andrew, any input on that?
Well, I mean, I knew the definition of the word, not necessarily as a genre, subgenre, dark fantasy, dark eldritch. So I'm going to use the opportunity to name check some of our contributors of the past. One of our previous contributors, David Farrow, wrote a really nice story for us called Liminal Spaces. And when Fran mentioned the liminality of the Eldritch, that immediately popped back into my head. And in that case, the story is very much a contemporary story, but it's something a little unsettling. There isn't really a specific thing that you can put your finger on as to what is wrong, but there is something wrong. And Farrow also has written, I think he at least has 3 collections of themed short stories set in I think it's a Washington State or Portland, Oregon vicinity setting called the Neverglades, which is a kind of, it's not a Twin Peaks, but it's a world he's created, a town he's created where there are things beyond the veil, and there is this sort of contemporary horror thing going on. I've enjoyed those a lot, but the story he gave us definitely felt Eldritch in that way. That word Fran used, the liminalities. That seems like a good point of reference for me.
Okay. Go ahead, Fran.
No, that's true. And Eldritch is something I'd like to see more of. We get very little of what is really Eldritch.
Okay.
But yeah, liminality, that's a good way to say it.
Another question from John. Down the road, how concerned are you about authors losing control over their intellectual property or even their style due to the growth of large language models like ChatGPT and its brethren? Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously the hot topic. In my understanding of how these systems work is that we're not really talking about. I find it highly debatable whether these things are genuinely capable of emulating a specific style. When I've seen examples where people have requested a text in the style of, I think it's very easy to read into what you're given more than you're actually seeing something that truly does what has been requested. And my understanding of how the systems work is that really you're getting, I don't know, it's not something that I think authors really need to worry about. I think if you cultivate your own voice, there's something there that, you know, sure, other people can emulate it, and I guess probably as these technologies extend their capacities, maybe they will be able to develop it too, or emulate it too. But I think what's more important is that authors concentrate on expressing themselves for themselves, enjoying that experience. I think that gives a life to their text that I frankly don't see in anything that I've seen coming out of ChatGPT and these kind of systems. It's impossible to say whether or not that's going to change in 1 month or 6 months or 6 years. But I would say that the main thing to do is worry about creating your own skill, creating your own voice, enjoying that creative activity. That would be my advice.
Okay, good. Fran, anything to add?
Just that anyone can copy your style. You don't actually, if you're really good and become well known and admired and people try to copy your style, that's a compliment. And you don't have any control over people doing that anyway. Someone can choose to do that. Yeah, we blanked out for part of it. The question was just what control you will have in the future.
Are you concerned about authors losing their intellectual property or style?
Oh, because of
ChatGPT and its
text
analogs.
generation machines. Yeah, well, I mean, there is a lot of stealing of writing going on, and that is a concern. But right now, the Copyright Office has come down on the side of if you produce something, if something's produced by text generation, that can't be copyrighted. So anybody who claims to do it that way, they're not going to be able to get a copyrighted story out of it. Of course, they can lie about it and say they wrote it themselves, but yeah, it's just going to get harder and harder to stop that from happening. There's a lot of new investment going into AI, and so it's only going to get harder, and there won't be any definite way to tell. But for now, if it's known that it's copyrighted, that it's AI, you can't copyright it. So that's something of a disincentive. But things are getting stolen all the time for years, like books, textbooks, fiction books. And you won't have total control over it. Sorry.
Yeah, I think it's true that what we're seeing with ChatGPT as a tool for text theft, like if, for example, if I take, to remove theft from the equation, if I take a piece of my own writing and I throw it into something like ChatGPT and say, rewrite this text, change the character names, change the environment, etc., etc. I mean, that's something that anyone could have done with a piece of my text anyway. I mean, it's more laborious to do it by hand, to change all the details yourself, but there's no way that the author of an original text can prevent that happening. So I think there's a sense to which you should not worry about it any more now than you did before. It's just a different mechanism for that. But honestly, I think outside of the real strange edge cases, like the problem that Clarkesworld have had, where they're effectively such a big target, for a lot of markets there isn't really a benefit to trying to hit us with those things. I think, I mean, there's no profit in trying to use GPT to make a sale at Mythaxis, because, you know, as soon as they start charging $10 a month for permission to use it, you're going to be running a loss no matter what you do. So, you know, and frankly, until I see just an astronomical improvement in output, the only inconvenience that Clarkesworld are seeing is an administrative one. In terms of the actual quality of these submissions, there's just no comparison between what real people write and what these systems write. So yeah, I think in terms of literally just asking for a prompt, if I say, write me a story in the style of John Paul, it's not going to do that exactly. It's going to do an algorithmic mishmash. It's going to, you know, if it's possible, to in some way find access to material that you've written and emulate your style to some degree. I guess that can happen, but I don't think it's going to impact, you know, the world any better than you can as yourself. So I would worry more about, you know, being a better John Paul than ChatGPT can be a John Paul.
And let's use that, Andrew, as a segue to a question from Sandra. Can you describe your selection process? Do you reject most stories without reading through? What things make you reject quickly?
Okay, so I mean, I'm basically I'm the primary reader for Mythaxis. I have a small reading team who are basically there as enthusiasm checks, you know, just in case I get too swept up in the moment and I end up with a short list from my submissions that sometimes keeps getting longer. And so I'll start asking them to double check. Am I, you know, just getting lost in the moment? It's not true that I read every submission start to finish, because it's very often the case that you can tell reasonably quickly, A, whether something simply doesn't speak to you as a reader, B, whether something just isn't at a publishing level of quality. And although, I mean, there are different senses in which a person can be an editor, and one of those senses is you help an author develop their material to the point where it is publishing quality. But that's not necessarily what our primary role is. And so there are cases where I will receive something that is, in terms of the quality of the text, isn't really there, but the idea is so good and it's got enough of a germ that I want to work with the author towards making that happen, and that does happen. But generally speaking, it's not a gut feeling. If something's good enough to read through, then it gets full consideration. If it's not good enough to read through, then I'll stop, because, you know, that's generally not going to change between, you know, the end of the first page and the end of the last page. I'm not a big fan of the killer first sentence stories where sentence one is, you know, it's like designed to hit with all the power of, you know, a thunderstorm, a lightning will strike, and that doesn't really work for me. I'm just as happy reading something that's a slow burn and really, you know, lands at the end. Equally, I can come to the end of a story, go back to the first page, look at that first line and think that was really well chosen, but it's never going to be the thing that makes or breaks. Occasionally it breaks, but very rarely is it the thing that makes me, you know, either buy on the spot or abandon it immediately.
Fran, same question. Your selection process, do you read all the way through? What makes you reject stories quickly?
Well, we do have a lot of first readers, and they'll leave comments. Our submission system lets them all leave comments on stories and rate them. And then I read some myself besides that, but basically, we don't necessarily read all stories all the way through. Sometimes you can tell very quickly that the level of writing is just not at all where what we're looking for. And occasionally there's objectionable stories that, okay, well, I'm not going to look at any more of that, and that'll get rejected. Sometimes there are stories that are good, that there's something to them, there's an essential good thing to them, but they need further work. So we'll decline this with recommendations of how to work on it. And if you want, you can resubmit it in a future submissions round. And that's worked for a number of stories, because it's very, very rare to get a story that doesn't need some work on it. So that's basically it.
Okay.
Did I answer the question enough for this person, or?
Well, we'll see. We'll give her a chance at the end. I think that our process is probably somewhere in the middle of those two. I read everything. I'm the first reader, the only slush reader. And then and we reject, as with many magazines, we'd reject something like 95, 97% of what we get. If I like something enough, then I pass it on to a crew of second readers, most of whom have been with the magazine for at least a year, maybe a couple of years now. And I know what their biases are and I know what their interests are. So them saying yay or nay doesn't necessarily make the determination, but it's useful outside input so that it's not just me, as Andrew said, getting carried away with something that isn't that great after all. And then everything, I'm a very hands-on editor, so everything that we publish has been through at least 3 and up to 10 rounds of revision. As long as the author is willing to work on it, and as long as I think we're making progress, then we keep working on the story. They're free to pull it back at any time. And I've learned over the years that I try to make a decision by the second round of revision, whether to go forward with it or not. If I feel it's not making progress by then I say, listen, it's not going to work out. Sorry. But most of the time, if I've asked for a rewrite, I'm willing to push through. And most of the time it ends up pretty well. It's a negotiation process, as with everything. And I want an author that will take seriously what I'm saying and think about it, but I don't want them to just uncritically accept everything that I say. I'm wrong some of the time. And I want people to fight back on things that are important to them, but not necessarily on, oh, I wanted a comma here and I don't want a comma there. Let's, fix on the larger items. At the beginning of our process, I read through everything all the way in the hopes that, and there are a few stories where they really pull it around in the end and you see, oh, that's where they were trying to go. I think I can work with this and help them to make it better. But the truth is, as both I think Fran and Andrew have said, you can usually tell within the first paragraph, usually within the first page, whether the story is going to work or not. And for me, one of the big determinants of that is pretty simple. It's whether you have effective use of grammar. If you can't use grammar properly, then it's going to be hard to resurrect that story. And I make allowances for authors who are not writing in their primary language. And you can usually, I think at least, that I can usually tell the difference between someone who's a good writer, who's writing in their non-native language, and somebody who's just not a good writer. So that for me, there are a lot of things that can make the difference, but that for me is kind of the first thing that will make me reject a story quickly. If you can't spell and you can't use grammar properly and you can't use punctuation, that's going to be too much work to improve the story. I know there are editors who feel differently about that. Like, well, commas are not that important, but for me, it's one of the things that I look at. I want to jump forward to a question. I'm sorry, Sandra, I promised that you would have a chance to say if we hadn't answered your question. Sandra is silent, so I assume she's happy. I'm going to jump over a question from Akis, and I promise I'll get back to it, to go to a question from Roger Hammonds. In works that you almost accept, are there common denominators regarding your reasons for rejecting? What should those authors focus on to improve their chances? And I'll start with that one. I take cryptic notes to myself as I read the story. And there are a few things that come up over and over and over. And if I had to pick one, then I think I would probably say engagement. If I don't find the characters engaging, then that's going to be a reason that I reject the story. And that's often and what I mean by engaging is I want to know what it is that the characters value. I don't have to like them necessarily, but I want to know what's important to them and what's driving them, what their motivation is. And if you jump in and it's a straight scene where they're fighting or there's intrigue or this and that, and it goes on for a couple of pages and I still have no idea why they're fighting. Why is this fight important to this person? Or why is poisoning this king important to this person? Then that's not going to work for me. And that's going to be hard to fix as well. So if I had to choose one thing, that's probably the thing I would choose. Fran, common denominators for rejection.
For rejection.
Or what people should work on to improve their chances.
Oh yeah, well, character is one thing, but character in terms of I have to like somebody, and I can't have a main character that is a rotten person. I just am not going to be interested in their rotten goals. So they have to have something that they're going for. Yeah, a goal. They have to have something that is attractive about their personality. And yeah, the other thing is just bad writing. If they may have a great idea, but it's just written just as too much of a mess and out of order and unclear wording, and it just becomes too much to deal with. Or you have a great idea, but you don't know how to say it. And that's
Actually,
very frustrating.
sorry, can I just jump in?
Yeah.
Fran, I think the question was also a little more specific about works that are almost accepted rather than just rejected. So things that are on the edge of an acceptance but don't make it. Are there any?
Sorry, the satellite just went out again. I got as far as the question was a little more specific.
Yeah, it was asking more specifically about stories that are almost accepted but ultimately, but ultimately are rejected. So are there any common denominators there?
What makes them
like a common denominator regarding your reasons for rejecting, if it's a near miss?
Oh gosh, no, not really. It just may not quite. It just doesn't quite make it in any specific way. There's nothing that one thing that I guess maybe the thing is most central thing might be if the story itself is not quite good enough as a story. If the whole overall story just doesn't grab me, then that would probably be it.
I think it's an interesting question, but it's a really tough one.
Yeah.
Because we're talking about the stories that in many ways are good.
Yeah.
Just don't quite convince in some regard. I think for me, it's always been a case of, I don't think there is a single, like a unifying factor. There might be just some flaw, and this kind of relates to the process as well. The whole evaluation process. I'll come to the end of a submission window with maybe a short list of between, I don't know, 5 or 10 or maybe 15 stories that I like, but I know that I'm buying for 6, slots in a magazine. And so already I'm going to have to cut some things that, otherwise I might really like. And I don't want to be buying stories now that I won't publish for a year or 2 years. So there's always got to be some kind of hard decisions made. And so for me, in these instances, it's not that there's a common denominator, but maybe there is something concrete that I can point to as to, maybe why, if you tried me again with this story, this is where I would say, this is where to focus on a rewrite. Previously, I've tried to give feedback to authors across the board if they request it, if they're open to it. And my submissions volume is getting to the point where it's becoming unfeasible. I find myself getting sufficient requests for feedback that I can't really say anything meaningful in the amount of time I have to do so. So I think for me, when it comes to the near miss submissions, that's probably where I will now focus my efforts for giving some kind of feedback on the grounds that, you sent me a story, I like it, it's not quite made the cut, so here are the things that, I can be specific in this case, rather than there being a commonality across the board.
Yeah, actually, that's true. I don't think you can look for one specific thing that is going to make a difference through every story you write, that if you put this in, that's going to make a difference, because publishers are all looking for different things. It's also a personal preference thing. So it may not have anything to do with you putting in X, Y, and Z, and then it's going to work. Like Andrew said, he can only choose so many stories per round, and so it may be a perfectly good story, not have anything wrong with it. It just isn't going to work for that time, or he already has 6 stories about time machines. He doesn't want a 7th. It's so I don't think it's that you should look for one particular thing to make sure that gets in there, because that's going to make the difference. Just, write the best story you can possibly write and edit it as much as you can, because that's one of the things, like we're all seeing stories that need.
Freeze
I
again.
guess she was going to say more work. Well, while we're waiting for Fran, thank you, Andrew, for refocusing our attention on the actual question. I appreciate that. Go ahead, Fran.
Oh,
You froze there for a minute.
Just that's what will make the difference. And if you love the story, that will communicate to the people who read it. So that's what I'd say to concentrate on, rather than one formula thing to follow.
Let me add a couple of things, as Andrew pointed out on the original question, from my perspective. Number one, we used to provide feedback to everybody who wanted it on all the stories, and unfortunately, as we got more successful and had more submissions, it wasn't feasible anymore. As with reading stories all the way through, I just don't have the time to do that anymore. 2 things that I do. One is for stories that reach our second readers. That is the second stage of our process. I let the author know that we're doing that, and all of those stories get personal feedback. It's fairly brief. It's pretty blunt, as long as they've asked for it. So that's something. Those are the true almost theirs, because they made it to that stage in the process, and I give a little bit of feedback on what could have been different. The other thing that is somewhat hidden, and to some extent deliberately so, in our guidelines or somewhere on our submissions page, is that for authors who have submitted 5 stories or more without having one accepted, I offer what I call overview feedback. That is, you pick 5 stories that you've submitted to us, and I'll take a look at all of those and try and give some general comments about what I'm seeing that could be better in terms of the writing across all of those stories, not just one particular story, because they could be one good story, one bad story, what have you. Not many people take advantage of that, I think, because most people don't find it, and I wouldn't have time if everybody found it. But I think in terms of submitting to us, that's a way to find out what I want. As Fran and many people have pointed out, each editor is different. So what I'm looking for is not the same as what Andrew is looking for or what Fran is looking for. So unless you really want to sell to us or to a particular market, I wouldn't worry that much about an individual editor's feedback or input. If all the editors tell you the same thing, then okay. But everybody's a little bit different. I'm going to go back to Akis's question, which was, do you have a sweet spot in terms of word range preference? And I'll answer that first. Yes, 6,000 exactly. That's what I'm looking for. You know, most magazines will have something in their guidelines page. They should have something on their guidelines page saying what their acceptable range is. And I think most editors will not be able to say this enough. Please read the guidelines. That tells you what we want, and there's no point in sending us something that we don't want. So ours say between 500 and 10,000 words. I've had people submit 60,000 word novels to us. And that, I mean, that you talk about things that will get you rejected quickly. Not reading the guidelines is one of them. That's just a waste of everybody's time. But yeah, I'm generally looking for something between 500 and 10,000 words, and 6,000 is a pretty good average for me. I don't publish much flash. It just doesn't work for me. It works for other people. So really a functional preference is between 2,500 and 8,000 words, something like that. But it's not a fixed number. Andrew.
Yeah, I mean, it says on our submissions page, I'm sure Eldritch shows, well, all the zines will say something. I publish a little flash fiction, so I mean, we say between 1,000 and 7.5 is the absolute upper limit. But I generally say that the further beyond 5,000 words a submission goes, the more it's going to need to impress. So I think it's easy for stories to balloon without necessarily maintaining quality. I've had submissions come in at 7,000 that are revised down over a couple of editing rounds to really good effect, and you end up with a piece that maybe is 5,000 words. You know, I've had one story published that the author cut something like 3,000 words from the first version they submitted, and I thought it was a really nice piece of work. I from my own experience as a writer, I've sold a few stories in the 4,000 word range, and I think I don't think that's necessarily, you know, I don't think there is a universal, but the things that I've sent out and had success with have tended not to go beyond 5,000, and 4,000 has happened a couple of times. So I don't know if that's a trend at all, or maybe it's just, it depends on the market. But as a result, I've started kind of aiming my own output. Success. So,
Andrew, you cut out a little bit at the end.
well, in fact, it was nothing to do with being an editor. So let's forget it.
Fran, preferred length.
Yeah, our minimum is 1,000 words. We don't have a hard maximum, but we've never found one over 9 or 10 that we would want to have published. And I think as the longer they get, the more difficult it gets to hold it all together. So yeah, that's about it. The range that we have published is 1 to 9. We'll look at longer stories, but we prefer the shorter ones. And also, yeah, a lot of the ones that end up getting published have had a lot edited out. Yeah, it could be thousands and thousands of words chopped out and made better just for chopping out those words. And we also do poems, and that's up to like 40 lines. Yeah, so that's it. The shorter, the better, but we'll look at any length. Not likely to get published over 9. So.
Okay. Fran, let's stick with you. Question from John. Paul, would you go so far as to suggest a ratio of how many short stories we should read each month versus how much we are trying to write?
No, I think read as many as you have time for and like, you know, if you treat it like an exercise, you may end up not enjoying it so much, and that could transfer to your writing. And also, if you get too academic about things, you gotta.
And satellite is behind a cloud.
Read stuff and say, okay, yeah, I'm just going to apply that to the story. And it can get academic and like kind of a very conscious level of writing, when sometimes you should just let your inspiration bubble up. So I wouldn't put any ratio myself, but you know, some people might. I tend to be less compartmentalized or organized like that. Do this and do this and do this. Read as many as you like.
Andrew.
Sorry.
Yeah, I kind of agree. I read a lot, not just for the magazine, but in general. I read probably more long form than short form, but even when I'm reading novels, I'll usually have, I have magazines, either like physical magazines, or there's online zines that I follow, maybe collections of fiction in my Kindle by various authors, and I'll tend to maybe break up the reading of a novel by dipping into a short story here and there, even if just that, rather than making a dedicated effort to explicitly read short stories, because I also write short stories. I think what Fran says about not turning something that's a pleasure into a chore is good advice, because you don't want to, negatively impact your appreciation of the form, because short fiction can be really beautiful, but if you turn it into, a chore, then your appreciation for that beauty, and maybe your ability to articulate beauty through it, could be affected. Why would we want that to happen?
Yeah, I would say I'm on board with what both Fran and Andrew are saying. I think that many people who are writers read, and they read because they enjoy it, and that's what you should do. I do think that the more you read, the better your writing may get, even if you're not reading analytically. If just reading for fun, you just absorb things that you think of as good writing. That's, I think, where just the extent I have any of my writing talent came from. But I read a lot because it's fun. That's one of the things that I do for fun, and I think that's the best way to do it. I agree that making it a chore is probably not your best bet. Read what you want because you want to, and that will feed into your writing.
And also, I think it's worth saying that just because you perhaps read long form doesn't mean that can't influence short form output. I'm always inspired by the novelists I read, but I'm, very slow when it comes to actually working on long form fiction myself. It can still add, spark to your own output, whether it's short form or long.
Yeah.
John, you look like you had a comment or question. No? I thought I saw you raise your hand. All right. Any other questions? We're just at the hour mark exactly, but if anybody has a final question, we can do that. If not, we'll let it go. All right. Well, thank you all for joining, for participating in this. I've enjoyed it. I do want to give the chance to Fran and Andrew for any last minute announcements or things that are coming up. Fran.
Just in terms of our anthology, it's the advanced reader copy stages. We're getting reviewers looking at it now, and I hope over the summer we can get it finished, and it's all illustrated. This is a black and white version. There's going to be a color illustrated version, and it'll be print and ebook, and then we're going to do an audiobook on it also. So look for that in the future. To Ukraine with Love, science fiction, fantasy, Eldritch, myth, and illustrated, and some stories for kids too. Okay, that's my announcement.
All right, great.
Thank you everybody for joining us.
Andrew.
Yeah, well, we have a new issue coming out. I was aiming for today because I kept delaying it for various reasons, but I think it will probably be Tuesday this coming week. And a week today, I will be in England. I'm in Barcelona right now, but I will be in England for EasterCon, which will literally be my first ever attendance of a science fiction convention. So, that's what I'm doing as probably just as a member of the audience. I don't think I'm on any panels, but this was my driver for being on a panel. So maybe for some future convention instead. But yes, if anyone's interested, the new issue will be what will it be? April the 4th, I think. Yeah, that's everything from us. It was nice to talk to you.
Great. Thank you from our side. We've got two anthologies coming up. One was published a couple of weeks ago, which is the complete 2022, which is all the stories we published in 2022. It's I advise you get it in ebook form. If you get it, it's a 900-page print volume in a 6x9 format, so it's huge and unfortunately expensive. But the ebook is much more manageable. And then I think it was meant to be in April, but I think we'll now push it to May. We have an anthology coming out called Museum Piece, which is stories about weird and interesting museums, which was a lot of fun to put together. So,
that sounds good. Yeah,
it is. It was really fun. So, and that was triggered by some submissions that we'd had at the magazine, which were like, oh, hey, I'd like to read more of that kind of thing. So,
wow.
There you go.
Very good. See, so the writers can inspire us to do more things.
Absolutely. Thank you all.
Definitely not a one-way road.
That's right. All right, and I will post the recording of this. Direct your friends and enemies to it. They can also hear this. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.